I consider myself a fan of Paratroopers since I was a child, and I bet I watched this series more than 10 times. So I created this small diorama depicting a sea company and a small French house facade during the 1944 Normandy campaign. Having these excellent alpine figures waiting in my stash for a couple years now, and after some research I came up with the initial planning of the scene. Using my homemade hot wire cutter, I looked for some basic pieces for a better composing, rectangles, cubes and triangles, you know. Finally, adjusting the base to the corners, to make it fit perfectly with the base size and proportions. This is the image I use as a reference for the French house, depicting some US paratroopers in the streets of Carentan in 1944. Obviously, measures and scale proportions were almost guesstimated and optimized for fitting into the scene, but I think they came out pretty similar. Prior to further detailing, I went for a basic sketching of the main elements, and I marked the positioning of the window and then hollowed the space to make it fit properly. Although these are the first steps, I better be precise while cutting so I can prevent myself to correct some potential errors in the future. Finally, I put together all the parts using white glue, giving the house its basic shape. Now it's time to fully dive into building construction. If your case is similar to mine, I have no idea about house building, materials or different stuff. So here it is a must to study different historic images, as well as some recent photos to know how real houses and buildings look like. And there is a good thing about it, these are a nice source of painting ideas and weathering for the upcoming projects, as real houses used to present a higher level of weathering than we may initially think. Trying to follow these premises, but also trying to stick as much as possible to my main reference, I changed my point of view and I started considering the building construction as some kind of overlapping layers. First, I went with the engraved textures and elements. Foam gets really easy to work with, and you can get complex textures and increase the depth of the facade by representing brick coats or some stonework around the window area. On the other hand, we cannot forget about the rest of details that don't necessarily need to be represented out of foam, but can be placed on top of it. For complementing the brickwork, I used this acrylic putty to apply a thin but deteriorated mortar coat. In this case, I looked for representing different grades of texturing, applying thicker coats on the lower section, as well as varying the direction for extending the putty, or representing heavy missing mortar patches on the wall can work for a realistic approach. Finally, I decided to conceal the rough foam texture from the backside by sticking to it some plastic sheet using double-sided tape. After that, I just cut the excess using a hobby knife and again some putty for achieving even and smooth edges. Okay, let me show you my preferred piece of the entire project. This wouldn't be a Band of Brothers inspired diorama without that piano in the middle of the streets of Carentan. And this piece captivated me since the first time I saw it. Although creating a village house just out of foam can be done, you always need to detail that work and include different accessories to your scene. Let me introduce you to Plus Model. Plus Model is a Czech hobby brand creating all you can imagine in scale to use in your projects. To be honest, getting a similar level of precision using my own materials would be impossible, and their collaboration made possible to complete this scene. They sent me all their accessories you see on the screen, masterfully casted into resin, and some of them highly detailed with dedicated photo etch parts. And for all of you interested, I leave you a discount link for their website in the description below. Make sure you check it out. The piano on its own just needed some flashes to be sand and a couple of really tiny holes that I quickly filled using black CA glue. And when all the parts are put together, the result is just impressive, specifically the piano keys. In the case of the streetlight, and for removing the ejector pin, I invested some time for masking the exposed transparent resin, so any non-desired sanding will not damage the transparent resin surface. Check now how the ornamental light supports look like once in place. In the case of the roof gutters, these are 3D printed parts. They are super versatile, as they allow you to adapt them to your building corners and shapes using the different type of connecting pieces, just like the real thing. Just remember that for gluing these resin pieces to the styrofoam, never use CA glue as it melts the foam and your work will be totally ruined. It is not about bricks, neither the texture wall. But in my opinion, the central feature of the house is this window piece, telling to the viewer that this is a real building, and it also gives the illusion that you can see what is inside if you get closer enough. Plus Model did an excellent job here, casting some crisp details and also providing a plastic foil for representing glass. I just added a sheet of plastic art to flatten the background, and later fill out the edges so the window gets embedded into the wall. Roof tiles were still remaining for this project. As my first time dealing with them, I found them easy to represent, but also they were so tedious to glue in place. Carentan houses' roof tiles were commonly made of slate stone and placed in a simple pattern, so some plastic art can be used for this task. First I cut a cardboard template, keeping the exact measures. Then, after cutting more than 100 of these tile pieces, and because I was looking for a deteriorated finish in the roof, I wasn't so severe here, looking for perfect 90-degree angles, but gluing them in a random pattern. When fully glued to the template, I added some light stone texture, using Tamiya putty and a stiff brush. For securing the same foundation and getting well-glued pieces, I use a squared piece of cork. This will make my life easier when securing the bigger places to the base. Moving to the cobblestone pavement surfaces, I cut some rectangular pieces, and prior to carving any texture, I cut the sides at an angle to make it fit with the base. Even though these pavement pieces won't be so visible in the end, I focused my efforts in representing a realistic cobblestone surface. So in my case, it is mandatory to use image references to get as closer as possible to the real pattern and size. First, using my hobby knife, I created the basic cobblestone pattern, and later using a wider tool, just like this mechanical pencil, I increased the gap among each cobble. Also representing an uneven surface here can be a nice option to add some variety to the scene. Finally, I add some tilting to a few of the cobbles. Just some light pressure can make each cobble to lay at a different height. For filling these gaps, I use the same acrylic putty I use for the facade. First, spread it with a spatula, and later I remove the excess for using a wet cloth over the piece. Finally, for the main street pattern, I went for a more detailed one, but this time, instead of drawing, measuring and cutting this carved cobblestone pattern, I decided to use this Tamiya cardboard sheet for scenography. I bought this one more than 10 years ago. Some of my friends used this type of materials in the past, and they totally recommended me. In my case, I was very surprised for good, as it really was easy to work with, and I just cut it with a standard hobby blade, and then I glued it in place using white glue. Now it's time to add some earth accumulations over the cobblestone. This real earth with different types of small rocks and sizes is so versatile that I have already used it for some of my projects. Also, I added a couple of foam bricks for my old Stalingrad diorama for a better blending with a city environment. For fixing the earth accumulations, I used a gravel and sand glue. This is just a matter of soaking the surface and let it dry, and when it does, there is no visible residue. Also, it extends by capillarity, so it reaches all the hidden areas, and the time frame needed to fully dry is significantly less than using white glue. Prior to paint the scene, I couldn't resist to place all the elements of the scene. And apart of making some dry fitting tests, the whole work can be appreciated now. Observing the interaction of the different elements and how the piano and the house wall act as a background for the figures. Moving to the painting stage in a project like this means preparing every single detailed part in the best possible way to assure an optimal painting. And in this case I separated each small part and I used some wooden sticks to hold each piece. Also some masking was applied in a couple of transparent parts, but above all, I put special attention to the street lamp. For priming, I chose again the Vallejo Black Primer. This project has been made out of different materials, and this paint is hard enough to seal out the edges and textures, but also it creates a thin and durable protective coat, no matter what the material is, and it has a great grip over the resin and photo etched parts. I like to use Tamiya paints for base coating pieces, not just because these paints have an excellent performance for airbrushing, but because the covering capability is well known for almost everyone, so it makes it easier to paint over a black surface. Using German grey as a base color for the cobblestone surface, I complemented the color variation, using also the tan and buff paints as well, highlighting the different individual cobbles of the base. For the rubble piles and earth accumulations, I airbrushed a solid coat of flat earth. This color has a slightly dirty shade, but in this case I added a small amount of grey color to the earth tone, so it gets a bit desaturated and more consistent with the paint scheme. Painting the house facade is a completely different subject. For choosing the right colors, as I said before, I carefully studied images and recent photos. To get an accurate color looking, a mix of deck tan and buff colors was used for the main wall motor texture. When it comes about airbrushing, it is not just about using good paints. There has been a while since Gallery has been sending me some of their airbrushes to use them. I have incorporated their products to my workflow, and the entire painting was completed using the Seaguar model with a 0.3mm needle. You can see how precise this is, and the type of precision results you can get with it. Also, this was my very first time using this compressor, the Turbox Mini. It is a quite a small machine which works nicely and had no practical differences with my air tank compressor that I have been using my last 10 years. The noise levels are quite good, even for such a small device. For those of you interested, there is a discount code for all of the products in the description below. Once base coating was completed, I switched to paint process. Using a palette composed of light flesh colors, bluish greys, ochre and different shades of neutral grey, I started painting the small rocks of the terrain base. As there is no need to paint every single rock, highlighting some of them is just enough to add some visual interest, as well increasing the depth of the base. Using again acrylic colors, I base coated some of the small parts that could not be painted using the airbrush, following the same approach as before. Choosing these colors was no coincidence. Researching photo references helped me to find the right and more feasible tones which match with the rest of colors of the house section. Differentiating every single brick makes the whole surface to have unrealistic recesses. So, prior to add any weathering technique, I proceed to fill all the brick gaps on the wall using this grey acrylic putty. Using a gummy brush to spreading the putty and removing the excess was really helpful. And what it's even more important, the result it gives is pretty authentic. To achieve a more detailed texture and get some chip look into the mortar coat, I applied a couple coats of chipping fluid. Later I hit the surface with diluted deck tan, and the paint was removed using an old but stiff brush. I mean, stiff enough to remove the paint from some selected areas, but also to not damaging the weak foam surface. The wooden plank for the roof section was worked in a similar way using chipping fluid. This time I tried to scratch the paint hitting the surface following the same direction as the wooden veins and creating heavier weathered wood effects towards the lower parts of the plank. Weathering the limestone wall section was one of my favorite steps when painting the entire scene. This material has a quite special finish, as it may vary to different color shades, and in my case I started applying Iraqi sand as a base. Later I added some different color filters. Adding a slightly different color shade to each block made the whole structure to completely change the final look of the limestone work. For representing some grime effects, I used olive brown acrylic paint. This is a dark grey brownish color, very accurate for representing streaking grime as well as some moisture effects. I surprised myself as I went full acrylic during all this time. Usually I prefer to use oil paints for these works, but I felt comfortable using acrylics and I wanted to test their performance for these purposes. Still keeping acrylics, I changed to a more diluted consistency, similar to a wash, and I applied some color variation to the mortar texture, applying a lighter shade using pale sand for the most exposed areas, and again some heavy diluted olive brown for the recesses and deepest texture. By this point, I started feeling a bit lost in the weathering process, not really sure where to move next. Before getting to any other weathering step, going for an oil wash was something that saved the day. Increasing the contrast of shapes and pieces is something that always helps me when I don't know how to keep going. In this case, adding the oil wash using a mix of sepia and Payne's grey defined the whole house section, and now that darker places have been highlighted, I could continue adding lighter colors. For the blocks surrounding the window piece, it was easy to simulate a more three-dimensional effect. by applying Vallejo deck tank in the upper areas of each separate block. Also, this same color can be used for stippling some texture in the joints between the mortar and the brick surface. Weathering scenography is an exciting subject, and there are plenty of possibilities depending how well maintained the house is, or the average weather in the area. I used again some olive brown for representing first some rain marks on the flattest areas, and second, a heavy moisture effect due to a leakage in the wall. Before weathering, the facade felt a bit boring with no visual interest, but now I think these two effects gave it a really eye-catching looking. As olive brown has a very dark value on its own, I chose a more vibrant green color for complementing the moisture effect. The key here is not to cover entirely the previous coat, so a color gradient can be seen. I also found this green color very convenient for applying some color washes and representing this time some light moss effects in some of the recesses of the bricks area next to the roof. In the case of the limestone, I thought some extra chipped or erosion effect could be a nice idea. Using a deck tank color, I first applied with a sponge for a more random distribution, and then applying it with a detail brush looking for some more intentional chipping over the specific areas. Finally, everything was turned out a bit by applying subtle filter coats using the base color. In the same way, wooden texture was enhanced applying some hand-painted wood paints. Chipping fluid weathering allows to get convincing effects, but in my opinion, applying a few brushstrokes in the correct area really gets the job done. If you missed the roof tiles, that is because I didn't weather them until now. I postponed this step because I didn't know how to proceed. When I look for real references, house tiles from Carentan area seem to have a dark grey color, sometimes with blue hues on it. But on the other side, it is tricky to make a correct interpretation, because usually roofs are wet due to the rain or their color changes depending how much light they reflect. For a first step, I ended up looking for some color variation and applying different grey color shades to the tiles. Next, for representing some rough texture, I chose to apply some speckling instead of working in individual pieces. After that, working again with a dark acrylic brown this time, I focused my efforts in representing some streaking grime, until the effect is noticeable. Representing some mossy tiles was a great idea in my opinion, again using the same techniques and applying the green paint in a wash consistency, which allowed me to get a wide variety of different moss levels. Finally, the roof tiles were finished adding an oil wash. These parts have a lot of recesses and gaps, and pieces like these need some dark paint to make them pop, so an oil wash was completely mandatory. Moving to the street base, I wanted this to be visually and aesthetically different, specifically when compared with the house facade, being the house painted in light colors and weathering painted using dark ones. Here, for the base, I focused on the opposite. A darker grey cobblestone floor with light and medium color dust effects. Even I went for different techniques. Rather than using just acrylics as before, I trusted my beloved oil colors to get the job done. The color choices were simple. I used Naples Yellow Red for the light dust shades, and for the darker ones I added bigger quantities of sepia color to the light dust. Even though I was applying dust effects, you can adapt the dust colors to enhance the base volumes and shapes by placing the darker tones closer to the main recesses. But when dry, I could make some adjustments, like applying some speckling for blending the joints between clean cobblestone areas and dirt accumulations. Obviously, when you work with oils, it is always a back and forth process, letting the oils to dry, checking the result, and later correcting the previous coat and making some adjustments to it. Moving now to accessories, it felt like painting really tiny models on their own. I first painted the piano, as it is the central piece of the terrain, and I was really excited to paint a piece like this, but again, I wasn't pretty sure how to paint it. After applying a light earth color as the base, I drew by brush some heavy wood paints over the entire piece. And also, modifying the direction of the wood paints for each board is a cool way of adding visual interest to this small piece. For a realistic wood staining, I just went for the most similar approach I came up with. Acrylic inks are a nice option as they contain vibrant colors and a glossy finish. They have low covering capability, so hiding the previous coat won't be an issue. just like staining the piano, right? And finally, I added some drops of black ink to the mix. In my case, I tried to replicate an old piano with worn boards and some chipped wood edges. Studying the image, I could notice that toward the edges of each panel, staining tended to get darker, pretty close to a dark amber color. So I did using oils, applying a not so thin wash over the edges and later blending the paint, not removing, to get that aging look. In the end, what makes the final piece to stand out was the chipped wood effect. Using red base acrylic color and a detailed brush, I painted some chipping over the panel edges, focusing specifically on the front area and piano keys. The combination of the light wood color chipping just on top of the previously darkened edges makes the whole effect to stand out really well. This was something that I didn't consider in the beginning, but it was the best choice I could make. About the street lamp, the most iconic process when painting it was the glass weathering. Obviously, I used my usual techniques here, airbrushing the base coat in a dark gray, followed by some dust weathering, taking the same color references I used for the base and some light chipping on the edges. Working with transparent parts, it's not so common for me, but when I do and I need to represent a dusty patina, I don't recommend to use dusty colors. This might feel meaningless, but our best choice here is to use matte varnish. Applying thin layers of matte varnish by brush or airbrush creates a pretty convincing effect on top of the transparent piece. It gets so close to a dusty patina, but the best part of it is that it lets you to see through it, just like the real thing. For this piece I applied multiple thin varnish layers, but letting them to fully dry. This matte varnish technique was also applied on the window glasses. First, window frames were painted in a chipped wooden finish, using chipping fluid and later some tap water to reactivate it. I started removing the white paint coat, focusing on the window edges and main parts. Then, this was followed by the always mandatory oil wash for an excellent definition. Using the plastic foil that came with the window set, I cut it into shape and I glued them to the frames. In this case, matte varnish was applied by airbrush as I looked for a softer application, applying the paint towards the corners of the piece, and later partially blending the varnish coat with tap water. I know blending is not the correct term, but you know, it is really close to the old weathering techniques. You can also use some other tools to represent some streaking patterns on the windows, creating different textures and sheen on the glass pieces. Last steps were about putting all the parts together. First, all the non-visible sides receive a coat of black paint. Applying a dark color for this task is a must. It frames the scene as it makes the viewer to focus directly on what really matters. Finally, all the separated parts were glued to the base using white glue. Personally, I'm a big fan of white glue because aside of what you might think, it creates a super solid bond between pieces, but also it doesn't melt the foam, which is really convenient. Once all the terrain parts were in place, I glued the Paratrooper figures. My first idea was to show the Paratrooper figures painting in this video, but that would take too long, and I think they deserve a separate video. So for all of you interested in how I painted them, if you would like to watch a dedicated video, let me know leaving a comment, writing figure in the comments box below. Putting all the different pieces together, and of course adding the two figures, really brought this project to life. Taking Band of Brothers as an inspirational source made this project really fun. Also, it was so exciting researching for references, as well as trying to replicate the colors and moods shown in the TV series. Easy Company acted as a big inspiring incentive to give it the final push for calling the job done. As I mentioned in the video, painting a small composition like this, it is not about creating outstanding pieces on their own, but to know how to balance the painting process and know which details should be accentuated. I'd better call this piece an ambitious display terrain rather than a scene or diorama, but the main idea and applied concepts are just the same. Choosing the characters and then building a whole layout around them, it's not an easy task. Working with versatile materials as foam makes the job easier, but this wouldn't be the same without plus model accessories. A big shout out to them from here. If interested in similar content to this video, click here to watch more modeling content, cause I'm pretty sure you will love it. So as always, I hope you found this video useful, or at least interesting. So thanks for watching and I see you in the next one.